Hello and welcome back to part 7 of the Character Portraits Mega Tutorial series. This series has definitely been a pretty interesting one for me to create as well. Having, this single drawing go through so many roller coaster moments, changes here and there, trying to figure out what's best for it. And it's really been pretty tough. So in this video, we're going to try and progress the drawing a bit more towards the final piece and see if we can improve it just a bit more. So let's go through quickly the overview. So for today, we'll be doing quite a bit of heavy rendering. What this means is that I'll try to focus on, rather than planning or rather than visualizing what comes next, I'll be taking the plunge and really start painting, trying to get things more accurate. And that is sort of the goal of this point number 1. And at point number 2, we'll be working on the character's face plus costume. So this one is essentially also part of, point 1, right? But with a bit of emphasis on the character's most identifying features. So right now, things are more of kind of like a sketch stage. It's kind of rough. It's not too great. So we're going to try and work on that a bit more. So this is really just generic painting, right? But I wanted to break this down so that, we get a good idea of what's actually going on. And then in part 3, we're also going to start the detailing process, which is basically planning the placement and design of various elements around the carriage, see if we can get things started on that front. So likely this will not be the very last episode in the Mega Tutorial series, but next episode is likely to be the last. So, unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I started this out wanting to really get the entire process of this, painting process recorded down. But unfortunately, because of, time limits, I want to keep things relatively compact. I want to deliver the key points as always. We weren't quite able to do everything in real time. But I think I still want to continue, my goal of having a good slice of each process displayed, so you can see how I do things, and then you get a good idea of what kind of things I'm looking out for during the process, right? So yeah, without further ado, let's get right into the painting. So this is about where we left off last time. Apologies if this is not exactly where. I've, in my own time, I've tried to kind of figure out how to advance the piece, how to, just a couple of rough sketches here and there to kind of figure out how things go. So I do apologize, but this is very close to where we left off. And there is also still a bunch of errors left in here that I do want to point out. So one of the big errors here is that because we're in this sort of situation where we're positioning our camera pretty much in the scene, or close to the character, one thing we also notice is that there's going to be a kind of distortion from perspective distortion from near to far, right? And while that occurs pretty obviously along the length of the carriage, it doesn't quite occur along the height of the carriage. So that is one thing that we want to fix pretty much immediately. So I'll go ahead and do that. And doing this is pretty simple. Usually all you need to do is to use a transform tool and add a bit of distortion to it. So this is also kind of where my experience in this, or rather my lack of experience in this sort of more the close angle full body drawings kind of show. Because generally speaking, I try not to distort my characters a lot with perspective, which means a lot of the times when you see my characters in situations where, there is a obvious closeness of the camera to the scene, usually it's only like a specific body part, or it's like a half pot or half body portrait, stuff like that, right? Usually when I do full body stuff, I tend to keep it in more of like a sort of a long lens, kind of a shot from a distance away kind of view to sort of retain the proportions, which is this visual style that I do prefer. But in this case, because we're attempting, right? The keyword is attempting. We're attempting this sort of closing in the camera on the character's style of doing things. Well, it's going to be slightly different. So this is going to be a first adjustment I make. Notice that by doing this, it really, makes us feel like we're in the train carriage. Like at this point in time, it still looks a bit weird, but if we make the adjustment here, it looks a lot better. So in terms of rendering, how would you start rendering, right? And it's same as before, we pay attention to the forms, we try and get, you know, along the way, right, we try to maintain the proportions, we try to maintain a bunch of stuff. And to get started, I just want to take a look at the scene as a whole and then just flip it back and forth to see what is wrong with it. So one thing I think we could start off first is to kind of deal with the character's face. The character's face, the lighting on the face isn't quite right? I think the proportions are about there. The hair is a bit large. The reason being is that sometimes we, especially when we draw in a more stylized fashion, it's kind of easy to draw the character's hair a bit too, you know, puffy. And then it gives off a bit of a different vibe, right? Because this character has kind of been in the works, not really been in the works. This particular illustration has been in the works for a while now. The character herself actually has undergone a bit more development. So it turns out she's a bit more of a serious character. So we at this point in time, I kind of want to adjust her look, adjust a little bit to kind of fit her, you know, image. And this is what I like to do with the liquify, because after a draft, sometimes it's not so much that you need to do an overhaul or completely paint over something, because you've already done a lot of work, you know, painting up the draft. What you need to do is to make some minor adjustments before you can essentially resume painting, you know, more freely, right? Because there's some very easy to make adjustments, like what I'm doing right now with liquify, that you can do with your peaks. So with this small adjustments, you can see we kind of got this strange look of her head being kind of forced forward, right, into sort of something like this, right? Which kind of makes sense because, you know, while she is kind of tilting her head to the side, she isn't bowing her head down very much. So it doesn't make sense for her hair to kind of raise up, like the back of her head to raise up so high. Plus, because we're in this sort of environment where, you know, we have this distortion going on, indicating that the camera is near the character, the foreshortening is also a bit more obvious, right? So, for example, if it was looking at a scene very far away, this might be a bit more accurate. But because we're looking at a scene from close up, her face being closer to the camera is going to be a bit more foreshortened and bigger than, you know, the back of the hair and the back of the head. So this is just kind of one step that I took to make this correction. And essentially, this rendering process is going to be a collection of those steps to see how far we can sort of get things to work out. And the good thing about liquify is that you can actually adjust body language quite well as well. Because, for example, sometimes, let's say your character's ankle is a bit weirdly positioned, you can use liquify to kind of make corrections even to that, right? Without having to paint over the whole thing. So I mentioned it a lot, but, you know, this is a good example of how it actually happens in practice. So in terms of rendering, what I'm thinking about now is how the light is coming down from above and hitting the character. So one thing that I do know is that, for example, if her jacket is kind of draped across her shoulders, you know, it kind of conforms to her form, the form underneath it, right? So her chest is forward and her arm is back, right? So there's going to be this area of void here, right, that I want to maintain. So when we are rendering, oftentimes I'm also tempted myself, and I also make plenty of mistakes, don't get me wrong, but oftentimes many of us are tempted to kind of like, okay, so, you know, there's a strange gap here, let's fill that in. But in reality, right, we sort of left that gap there earlier on because we saw what it's meant to do. So, you know, do pay some attention to that and be careful of it as well. And then when we're rendering things, a lot of times when, you know, let's say we got something somewhat in place, right, and then we're not sure what to do. So rather than, you know, just continuously adjusting something and then wondering why it's not working out, we've got it into a good position. Think about it in greater number of surfaces. Because, for example, here, right, it's previously I was just thinking about this as two surfaces, one above and one below. So one receives light, one doesn't, right? So when we're rendering, we're doing more heavy rendering, we're focusing on the rendering stuff, working on the forms. We could, for example, do a bit of a crease here. And then think about how these surfaces are not quite equal, right? For example, one might be sort of at the bending point. And then you think about it, is this a smooth bending point or a rough bending point? And then you think, okay, it's a smooth bending point, so we kind of have it like this, right? It's a bit smoother. And then towards the end, we can have it have, you know, just a bit of couple of creases here and there. You know, and then there we go, right? And for example, at this point in time, you might notice, okay, wait a second, you know, this isn't quite exactly how the form goes. While we are focusing on the form of this general thing, we actually misplaced it against the character's chest. So if we spot that mistake, it's easy to remedy. Usually I'll just select it and kind of hold down Alt, left Alt, and it allows me to duplicate. If you look in the history bar, it allows me to kind of duplicate and move that thing down, which kind of moves and lines up the and helps us line up the form that we're painting, right? So this is kind of the basics of what is going on. And we want to basically keep doing this until, you know, the drawing reaches a more satisfactory place. So another thing, right, this is also a great time to highlight it, is that, for example, we're drawing the character's braids coming out. So previously, all we needed to do was to indicate it and to tell us that, okay, her braids are here, and her braided head is here, you know, it's done. But now, because we're actually starting to paint, we're going to have to pay attention to exactly how the form of the hair goes, and then kind of paint that as we move along. So the thing about this is that, you know, braids are pretty complicated. So you can look up a you should actually look up a reference on how to draw, or just a reference image on how exactly they are laid out. So basically, it's actually, interestingly, a braid, as you see, actually three strands. It's not 2 strands, it's actually three strands. I have a hard time saying 3 strands kind of interwoven into each other and creating a pattern like this, right? So basically, every new strand, you want to overlap the old strand, you want to overlap the old strand, you want to overlap the old strand, and stuff like that. And then this is kind of how I like to think about it, right? We're overlapping the old strand as we start a new strand, and then as we get to this part, because notice how that is bending along this line. It's this part here, it's not going to be as fully illuminated as the bottom, or excuse me, as the top braids. So we're going to just leave it as like the top facing surfaces of the braid is going to be light up or lit up, and then it's going to look like this. So also at this stage, you know, what you can do to check is to see how the hair flows. So what actually happens is that this piece of hair here, it kind of flows in, it comes out here, and then it comes out here, right? That is, let's call it strand number 1. So you kind of want to have this continuity, and sometimes if your braids look weird, or you're drawing a braid rope or any material really, and it looks weird, it's because of this. And then if we draw our second material, or actually our second strand, so this braid kind of comes in from here, it goes out from here, it goes out from here, it goes out from here. So this is number 2. And then for third strand, it comes in from here, it goes out here, here, and here. So as I said, it's actually 3 different strands of hair kind of braided together. Even though the alternating left, right, left, right, left, right kind of gives you the impression that it's 2, it's actually interestingly 3. So, you know, just in case you're wondering, or sometimes you're like, wait a second, you know, why is that? Why are there 3 strands? I thought there was 2. Just so you know, it looks like 2, but it's actually 3. So enough of this segment of me talking about this. So what's also important next is to kind of think about how for example, this particular strand of braids, how it lies on how it positions itself on the shoulder and chest area of the character. So it's clearly not coming straight down, right? That's not how it works. So what we can do here, I think, let me try this, is, for example, we could copy paste it, get rid of the extra stuff, and then kind of leave it like this with a bit of adjustment. So what I'm doing is that for the higher position of the braid, or the area of the braid higher up, I'm giving it more of a squished look, because they're kind of lying at a 45-degree angle, right? So this is the character, you know, this is the chest, the braid is coming along this way, right? So the braided section here is a bit more bent, and then it kind of transitions into a vertical segment later on. So for the bent segment, bent is a strange word. For the segment that is more lying closer to the horizontal, we're going to have to make it a bit more foreshortened, right? Because as you can see here, you know, my method here is kind of crude, so it's not too great, but, you know, we kind of have an idea of what I want to do. So if it's not too great, we can always kind of pull back and then think about it again, right? How is it best? What's the best way to do this? So once again, Liquify can come to our rescue, because the thing about Liquify that's really good about it is that it's a tool that follows your intent very closely. So if you have the right intent, right, if you know what are the changes that you want to make, you can make them really fast and you can make them pretty accurately. And maybe even in situations where you can't get the accuracy that you want, you at least get it pretty close, so that when you paint later, oh excuse me, accidentally cut it. So when you paint later, you don't have to go through the whole ordeal of having to repaint everything. So it's more of like an intention-based editing tool, right? We're not just painting over and over and then checking our intent a bit across here, checking if what we want is happening, right? We want to be able to do it on the fly. We want to be able to do it as quickly as possible. And so this is kind of the point. So for the next step, I do want to start working on the character's face. Remember how we were talking about working on the character's face and costume? We'll bounce between that and this a bit as well, because now the character's face is really bothering me. So let's see if we can get it sorted out. So similar to what we've just been doing, a couple of things you can do with Liquify is to sharpen edges. Because, for example, you can see here the character's jaw is a bit too soft. We can sharpen it up. We can adjust the size of her ear. We all make all these small changes in the Liquify tool, but importantly, we also need to start making some big changes. So for example, the lighting here is a little bit off. So for example, the eye socket of, most of us, our eye sockets are at least a little bit sunken in. So when we're drawing kind of an extreme angle, not extreme angle, but when we're drawing an angle where the light kind of cues us in on this type of shape, we want to be a bit more careful and kind of err on the side of caution. So rather than under displaying something, we might want to slightly over display it, or take the risk of over displaying it a little bit so that it kind of makes a bit more sense. And then for the character's eye, we kind of want to make sure both eyes are aligned in the correct way. Right? Like small changes like this can help move your drawing in the right direction. And then sometimes there are some couple artifacts because of the selection bound during Liquify, and then we can quickly fix it with stuff like a spot healing brush. So these are really just small things that I'm pointing out just in case you're wondering what's going on. But for the most part, all I'm doing is, painting the character in. So if we want her hair to be a bit more, like a, not stuck directly to her face, we can introduce some shadows. We can introduce some shadows to tell the viewer that, okay, the hair is actually not stuck to her forehead. It's kind of a bit above, which is why it's kind of generating these shadows or cast shadows on the character's face, right? And also there's a form of the eye socket that we're also paying attention to right now. Because previously our split was just what is in light and what is in shadow. But now when we want to render things more, we kind of have to look at it and go, okay, for the things that are in shadow, how do we split them up, right? What areas are going to receive less light and what areas are going to receive more light? And the important thing here is to kind of maintain the divide between what is in light and what is in shadow, right? The things that are in light have to be more distinctly brighter than things that are in shadow. So this is the kind of way I like to think of it, to kind of keep the two things clear. Although sometimes I totally understand it can be challenging as well, especially when we have a bunch of bounce lighting coming around, and it's kind of like, okay, so the shadow area is receiving a bunch of bounce lighting. And then, how is that going to hold up compared to for example, the darker side of the bright area? And then, that's going to be a challenge as well, right? So for me, I try to keep this idea in mind as I paint. Although you can see that after a while, sometimes things get a little bit disorganized, so we have to try and pull it back a bit. And one thing I also noticed is that sometimes after painting for quite a while in like a lower resolution, you can sort of run out of painting space, right? What I mean by this is that you are trying to get something sharpened and more defined, but it's really hard to do with the limited, pixels. You just don't have enough pixels, and right now we're getting a little bit close to the territory of not enough pixels, so we want to pay attention to that as well. And continue to kind of make these small adjustments to the character. Because another issue when we're working with smaller or a smaller canvas is that very small changes are hard to see. But the thing about that is that because we're drawing like a character, it's sort of kind of like a sensitive zone, right? You don't want to mess things up because it's like the focal area, it's very noticeable. Working on a small resolution can be sort of a little bit annoying because you make a very small change and then the drawing goes from looking pretty good to there's kind of a problem, right? Because the same change in like regular painting resolution would actually be pretty big. If you get what I mean. So basically it's easier to make errors here when we're working with a smaller resolution, but it's also easier to make big changes as well, which is really helpful early on, where all you want to be doing is making big changes and seeing whether your big changes are what you want. Right? But for now, because we're still kind of cleaning things up and dealing with the rendering stuff, we still can do this, right? So for this stage of the rendering process, all I'm doing is correcting mistakes, checking the form, correcting mistakes. Sometimes, I throw in a bit of lighting adjustment, throwing a bit of form adjustment, as we saw the hair, right? We want the hair to be a bit more, have a bit puffier, if you could call it. And one thing I also kind of want to do is to give the hair a bit more layers, right? Sometimes if your hair only has one layer, it looks kind of strange. And because we're not painting with a super thin brush just yet, we'll save that for like the final detailing and finishing touches. You can run into a situation where the hair looks a bit too fake, even for this early stage of rendering. Same thing, right? As I just mentioned, how it's hard to paint in a small resolution when the things are a bit more detailed. Here is, right? Because previously the corner of her mouth was really, really big. It was obviously not intentional, and it was good enough for the the sort of preview sketch, but for like a full painting, it's obviously not going to fly. So these adjustments really need to be very fine. So for now, we're going to not spend too much time on small fine details like that, right? But we're going to try and find things like the shape of the chin, for example. We want to deal with that a little bit. Bigger things that we can deal with before we do the smaller things. So again, this is a bit more on a bit more advanced side of things. Generally, you don't have to worry too much about this, and you can always just start with a high resolution. You don't have to go to low resolution and work with this. So this is really just me sharing some tips I've learned, and for some of you that may be actually quite helpful, I hope. So yeah. So now that we're at this point, we want to continue painting, but we also want to continue checking the form of the character's face, because sometimes we get a bit too much into the painting, and then we don't notice some forms being left out, right? For example, the sharpness of the cheekbones, the kind of divot, I guess, on the side of the nose. Very minor things like that can also affect the painting's quality as well. So for example here, right, notice that I actually didn't want the character's eyes to be open very, very wide, because it adds a bit of a very surprised look to her that I don't intend. So we're going to tune that down a bit and see how that suits the character and how that suits the setting. And then we can throw in a very strong highlight, just tapping the canvas with the stylus is enough to create this. And then we want to shift her gaze to the camera, so we'll do something like this. And then we can check back and forth, right, what has changed, what is not doing so good. And once again, right, if we need to, we can pull out our friend Liquify to realign the eyes. And then draw in fold in the eyelid. So basically what happens, this is basically what happens for the next, couple of hours, depending on how big the piece is. For this piece, I'm going to anticipate I'll be spending quite a while on this, really just repeating this process for a lot of the character, right? For example, the character's head. Then after I'm done with this, I'm going to move on to the character's shoulders, maybe check in on the other parts of the body. It's not going to be easy, is what I'm trying to say. So the bigger, the more expensive the drawing is, the more kind of difficult it's going to be. So as you also notice, right, the big image, the overall image hasn't changed much because, right, we've kind of committed to this particular arrangement. We're not going to change the big picture anymore. We're going to deal with, the smaller things that, kind of need painting in, kind of need adjustment. And if, let's say, we bring this drawing to a higher level of detail and then we notice something is wrong, right, we can still make the adjustment then. So, it's a fluid process. I think it's the right way to think about this. So here I am, kind of adjusting the flow of the hair, the layering of the hair. It was a bit off just now. And basically this is what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of hours. And let's see this and let's see if there are more things that I can kind of help you guys explain more clearly at this stage. So one thing I like to do also is to just copy paste and then use warp, free transform warp to sort of make changes like this, right? For example, the character's eyebrows, stuff like that. So again, we continue to make these adjustments. For example, I noticed now that her ear is a bit too big for for her current face. So I'm going to make an adjustment, a tad bit of adjustment there, and I'm going to change the silhouette of the chin just a little bit. And then these very small changes really add up over time. So as you can see now, the character's face has undergone a very, very, very slight change, but in reality, it's a lot closer to a finished product than where we were. So this is kind of the action that goes on per se, which is called the core of today's video. So once again, I don't want to, at least for this project at the moment, I don't want to make it a bit too long and too detailed. Plus there's a lot of narration, so eventually I'll run out of stuff to say and then I'll just be painting and I'll be repeating the same thing like a broken record. So we'll do a little bit more and then we'll jump forward in time to kind of look at what happens next. So as you can see here, now I'm kind of figuring out the abdomen area. The abdomen area, the upper, the mid torso area of the character. How do we do this? How do we kind of get this shape in, right? How do we get it all done? So for example, the middle line is somewhere around here. So I kind of want to keep the highlights and maybe on this half, I would say, if any. And then we kind of want to have the crease of the dress. Like sometimes when you bend your hips, there's a crease. And then it lines up like this, right? So this is what we want to try and get done. And this is really helpful because sometimes when we are drawing a particular costume and then the costume feels like it's a bit too stiff, it really isn't a case of the costume or the overall form being too wrong. I might eat my words because I might find a major error with the pose and the costume in a couple of hours or a couple of minutes. But one tip that does hold true, for some of my completed pieces that I thought turned out pretty well, is that sometimes, you need to add a bit of artificial complexity to your character. And oftentimes that does come in the form of making the dress a bit more detailed, making the dress or making the shirt a bit more creased in areas, as appropriate as you can make it. Like for example, obviously if you have a character that's like super clean, clearly they iron their shirts, it doesn't make sense for them to come out with a very creased shirt. But you know what I mean, right? Sometimes you can add on some artificial detail, and this is also something that I'm looking to do in this stage as well. So as you can see, this is what we've been doing. We've been adjusting the form, we've been making all these changes to the character. And one thing I also want to notice is that the character is casting a shadow. It's a cast shadow in this area. So I want to commit to it and make sure that it's actually a cast shadow, right? It's not just for fun, it's not mixed up with the brighter area around here. So as we proceed, one thing we also want to look out for as we kind of render is to kind of check back and forth to see if the gesture has changed a bit too much. So what I mean by this is that, for example, if previously what we liked about this was that the character was in sort of a relaxed state, if our rendering made her into change the body language, for example, this area here looks a bit weird to me now. So I do want to kind of undo a bit and see what went wrong per se. So what I did notice was that this area actually should be in shadow, right? So it's to give off the waist. I want to indicate the waist, even though it's not directly visible in this particular scenario. And then, that's kind of how we solve the problem. And again, there's so many things here that I'm going to take some time to solve. And now I'm kind of looking at the knee, figuring out how, the knee is a little bit... If you look straight down at your leg, and you look at your knee, straighten your leg and look at your knee, you'll notice that right before the knee, right, your quads kind of end here, your quads sort of end here, and then there's like a little bit of surface that you can see of the knee before it kind of blocks out the rest, right? So this is the kind of form that we want to try and recall when we're doing this. And I want to make adjustments to the thickness of the leg if it's applicable, and stuff like that. So basically a lot of this stuff. For example, we can remember that the calf is kind of behind the knee. And this situation, it might be hidden a bit more. So it might be an area with more shadow. It's going to be darker. And basically stuff like that is what I'm paying attention to right now as I paint. Right, so as you can see, it has changed a bit. And I sometimes want to look back and go, okay, so in terms of bigger perspective, the calf kind of slots in behind here, right? This is where like the middle part of the knee, and then you have the hamstring surface, and you have the calf surface. The calf surface is a bit higher up. So I want to kind of pay attention to that, excuse me. And kind of connect the calf in a bit higher up, rather than a bit too low down. So yeah, so this is kind of the process that I'm currently going through, and yeah, so far what we've been doing is doing lots of heavy rendering. So as I promised, this part is fully shown. I want to also jump forward to a bit where things are a bit more rendered to show you how that also happens during that stage. We've worked on the character's face a bit and her costume. There's still a bit more to do, but I'll do a lot of this same level of stuff off camera or off recording, because it's going to take really long. And we're going to kind of jump back in here and continue with these 3 points at a slightly more finished stage. So here we go. Here's the time skip. Hey, welcome back to the video. So for you, it has only been like 3 seconds, but for me, it's been a couple of days. I've spent a bit more time working on this piece, and this is where we left off before the time skip. And here's where we are after the time skip. So, generally in the big picture, not much has changed. But, well, in terms of detail, we have done a bit more rendering. We've definitely made quite a bit of progress, but, there's still a bunch of stuff to do. So let's get right to it. So as I mentioned before, sometimes during the sketching process, you want to up your resolution, and that is what we have done this time. The resolution is currently pretty high. And, in between the sketching stages and stuff like that, I went back and forth, and you might notice that some details like the braids got reverted accidentally, which is also something I just noticed. So, we can fix that pretty easily. So all we need to do is to kind of go back, steal the braids, and then come back here and paste them. and we're good to go. So, let's continue rendering the artwork from where we left off. So, what I was saying was that we're back, and we're currently working with an artwork that is slightly more finished. This was a couple more hours of work. It's slightly more finished, and now I want to show you what happens, what are the kind of steps you want to do when you're dealing with a mid to a late stage of finishing, right? Because we showed you, I showed you an earlier stage of finishing, and now we're going to talk about the mid to late stage of that process. So yeah, let's go. So as you can see here, the character's face is a lot more detailed because I managed to up the resolution and done a bit of actual drawing. Unfortunately, because of how big the drawing is, the character's eyes will forever be pretty small. So it's important to kind of work in the details, but it's also kind of really small reward work to reward ratio. So for this, I don't want to spend too much time on it, although I will say that it's important to get some of the basic features accurate, right? For example, the folds in the eyelid, the eyebrow. You kind of want these basic things to line up well. You don't want any major errors with them. And I think we've cleaned it up reasonably well at this point for this piece. So as we continue painting, you notice that some of the changes I've talked about, I reverted, and some of the changes that I have, not talked about, I've added. And so this is really the ongoing flow, the flow of painting. You're finding stuff that you want, that you like about the drawing, and then finding stuff that you want to change about it. And it's really an ongoing process, right? Whereas previously we had our character's ear way too low. Now we have it a bit too high, so it feels a bit disjointed. Now it's a bit too big. And then, we just continue making adjustments like that to bring the artwork to a finish. So let me get this old image out of the way so we can focus on the new one. So sometimes, let's say we've done a bunch of rendering and then we want to really start cleaning up. What I like to do for forms which require a bit more precision and are a bit more uniform, right? For example, a character's chest area here. Instead of using my usual brush and kind of making a mess, like having lots of brush strokes, we can have a round brush and basically just painting the forms with a soft airbrush, right? And that's going to give us a very clean look right away. It's not always necessary because sometimes, the rough brush work is basically free texture when appropriate. But in this case, right, where we don't want that, super rough texture anymore, especially in places where, the form is very uniform, there's no justification for it to be very, very messy or creased up, like this area where the dress is more, fitting, stuff like that. We want to make sure that the form also follows the form that we depict follows the form that is kind of supposed to be there. So the same thing with here, right? We kind of want to deal with this, and the way I deal with folds like this is that you've got to think of folds as things kind of fading out. Things fade in and out, right? So when usually at a point where the cloth is pinched, like that, let's say the side of the waist, the cloth is pinched here. What you want to do is to kind of try and make the fold where it starts very small. Kind of want to make it small. You don't want to make it too obvious. Maybe sometimes you don't even want to start it at a fold at all, right? You can start it like this. But for this case, we want to just give it a little bit of a fold, and then have it kind of travel through. And then as it goes further and further away, it becomes bigger and bigger, depending on if there is something, kind of also pinning it to the other side. So in this case, there really isn't anything too much. So I allow the fold to just kind of fade out very gently here where the lighting is not very bright, and then we don't account for things very diligently. Yeah, so something like that, right? So same thing for a fold that's kind of, or crease or fold that's kind of going straight down. Right, something like that. You want the beginning, for example, you can see here that I added in this black strip or this dark strip here. It's a bit too strong, so we want to tune it back. We want to kind of reinforce that the form of the hip is the priority, right? Anything other than that is not the priority here, because here is where the cloth is very fitting. So you won't have issues such as the cloth, you know, like bending out of shape or, you know, creasing straight away here. So this part is not where it creases. But after that, right, the crease start to form, where it's very sharp, and then it kind of fades out, right? Because there's nothing forcing the crease to hold its shape further away. So this is kind of how I would draw, you know, the creases in the dress in detail. And normally I don't go too high detail. I want to indicate the crease. I want to tell the viewer it's there. And then, you know, it's kind of like, you know, my job is done, right? Especially for more complex pieces like this. If you really want to draw every crease, it could take a prohibitively long amount of time. So for closer quarter shots, like let's say if I'm doing just the character's face portrait, you know, I'm up for the creases. I'm up to draw the creases in her shirt collar, stuff like that. That's all great, right? Because it's close up, we can show off a bit of detail, it's all great, no problem at all. But when drawing things from a bit further away, we don't need the creases themselves to be super high detail, if you get what I mean. So for example here, right, we can have an area here that is not completely hanging with the dress, that kind of follows the character's form, because this is kind of like the lower abdominal area where your stomach, or rather your lower abdomen leading into the groin area is going to fold down. Fold is a strange word for this case, but it's going to kind of face downwards a bit more. And then, you know, your fabric is not going to follow it entirely, but it's going to follow it a little bit. So we want to kind of indicate that kind of change in form, and then we can add a crease there to sort of say, okay, so the fabric did not follow it, the fabric went this way. Right? It's a bit rough, but, you know, it's something that is kind of a recurring theme, right? We always go from rough to smooth, rough to smooth. So even right now, as we're doing sort of this kind of late stage rendering, or relatively late stage rendering, we still want to kind of pay attention to the forms, and if we can add any extra detail that's going to help the drawing become better. Right? We want to avoid adding things that make the drawing worse, and want to add things that make the drawing better. So yeah, stuff like that, right? For example, we could indicate the waist a bit more clearly. For example, there could also be another crease coming out from the waist. So we can do something like this, right? And then for now, I'm using a smudge tool. This is another application of the smudge tool. For example, as you can see previously, these were straight lines, and I just smudged the end of it, so it becomes something like this. And yeah, so for here, right, because the character's leg it's not quite flush with her hip joint area. It's going to have a couple of creases, so you know, we can try and show that, right, depending on how creased it is. And then we can have the dress kind of fold away on the other side of the leg, like so. So this is kind of how things are going right now. I think it's starting to take shape pretty nicely. For example, right now I'm looking at the character, I'm like, okay, so most of it is pretty okay, so let's get back to work on the face just a bit more. So for this kind of late stage rendering, a lot of times you're really just cleaning up a lot of unwanted brush strokes, making sure you're adding in the wanted brush strokes. And for example here, well, as much as possible, right, if I was a bit unclear earlier, breaking out my own sentence, we want to try and show the variations in lighting at least a little bit at first, and then we can tune it down. So what's happening here is that this area of the neck under the chin is it's actually, there's a bit of depth to it, right? Because there's an area under your chin that is there. And so we have that, right? And then it's going to kind of fold under. And then for this area here, it's going to be super dark, right? But for this area here, it's going to receive a little bit of bounce light from its surroundings, so it's not going to be so dark. And so we want to make sure we account for that as well. We don't want to forget about that. It's pretty important. And it adds quite a lot, right, if you apply across the drawing to your piece. So for example, you can see the hair here is really messy. I'm not going to bother with it for now because I'm still painting the things underneath, right? So for example, this collar, I want to get that right. I'm gonna get her collar right. like so. And a light bit of detail here just to placehold for now. And then my method usually is to kind of zoom out and take a look at the drawing. Okay, is anything very bad? Nothing's very bad. Continue, right? Did I make a mistake? Did I add in new errors? You know, if no, continue. So that's kind of my style of working. You might very well have a different kind of preference to how you like to work. That is perfectly fine. That's perfectly respectable. And so, yeah, so we want to continue looking at this, and now I want to kind of figure out, okay, so how does her braids end up in front of her? And yeah, so this is also part of figuring out the form. So for this part, we can have the braids a bit in shadow because it's being kind of covered up by this mass of hair that we'll try to account for, but we might not be able to explain entirely, right? So we'll kind of draw something like this. It's behind a shadow. It's something like that. Right, so this is one of the parts that, you know, okay, I'm going to have to come back to this a bit later to kind of sort it out. Maybe I need to flip the canvas to figure out what's going on. But one thing I do know is that because we are essentially showing that the character is tucking a bit of her hair behind her ear, when we're rendering hair, what we can do is to draw a full stroke. And then kind of add the highlights along the stroke. So something like this tends to work well for me. It's a bit messy, and I know, and I don't think I'm the best at drawing hair out there, but I think it works well enough to the point where most of the time, if I spend a bit more time on this, it's going to look fairly decent. So at this stage, we are doing more fine rendering. The goal is to get things to, or as close as possible to a finished stage, but not quite yet. The reason being, if that we just spend all our energy like single-mindedly trying to force ourselves into the complete piece right now, where, you know, there's still a bunch of stuff yet to be done, a whole lot of stuff, you know, to account for. What's going to happen is that I'm going to spend way too much time on a single part, and then the rest of the drawing falls behind. And then what's likely going to happen, right? For some people, it might not be, but what happens for me is that I get very demoralized because the drawing looks so lopsided. You know, it's not looking good. You know, the good stuff isn't coming out. You know, it's yeah, a lot of the parts of the drawing are looking a bit jank, and you know, it's kind of demoralizing. So to kind of avoid that, I usually try to paint more inclusively. I try to include all kinds of areas of the painting. I don't want to be like, okay, we'll work on this area only and then forget about the other areas and then, you know, regret about it later or regret it later. And yeah, so cleaning up the neck area. So for example, this thick line here, right, shouldn't be here. What we can do is, for example, we can try out a couple of strands of hair, a thick strand of hair, and then like 2 strands of small hair coming down like this. Like this shape here doesn't make sense. And then we can connect it to the other stuff and connect it to the other side, and let's give them a couple of cast shadow. You know, they cast shadows as well, like so. So we can even extend the shadows a little bit more, like this. And then we can have a slightly more saturated area here. And because we know the form of the kind of trapezius muscle that kind of extends here, it kind of goes like this, right? It kind of goes like this, and it goes like this, and it goes like... It's kind of like from the ear to here, to here, to here. So this piece is a bit hard to show with lines, but it's kind of like this, right? It's kind of like this. It's kind of like this shape. So we kind of want to keep into account that this shape is here when we paint. So for example, moving the braids up a bit to kind of account for the presence of this particular volume, this particular form. You can move the braids up a little bit to kind of compensate for that, and that's going to help us indicate that, okay, the trapezius muscle is here, the character is bending her head that way, so this line is going to be pretty rigid, and then we can make our continued changes here. And the one thing I do want to pay attention to is that sometimes when we paint areas that are really bright. It's easy to just take your brightest color and throw it everywhere to make it super bright. And I think in a way that is not a bad instinct, because it does remind you that sometimes, you know, when we're looking at something really, really bright, we don't care how exactly the form is, we just know the whole area is very bright. So it works in terms of photography, but the thing about photography, you know, is that the subtleties are still there, right? The subtleties of how the form exists are still there, even though it's overexposed. And for me, at least, right, as someone who just draws, difficulties show up because, you know, I don't know how exactly the form is without, you know, kind of doing the full process of painting it. So it might actually give me some trouble if I were to just, you know, spam, per se, the brightest color straight away. So another thing that in this kind of stage that you can do is to think about the underlying forms and make sure that you're still working with them correctly. So let's take a look at this, for example, right? I can open a new layer. I can kind of give the character a shoulder and an arm. You know, just for you know, checking purposes, just to check that it works out well. And then it's kind of like, okay, so this is how her arm would be if, you know, everything was going to plan. Okay, so if we take away the arm, does the underlying shoulder look like it's conforming to the idea? And one thing I noticed here is that because the character is kind of leaning back, this area here is generally going to be a bit brighter. But right now it's a bit too dark. So we can adjust that. We can make some adjustments here. Right, and then we bring it back, and then we notice that, okay, so we can bring her shoulder out just a little bit to see how that works. But on the other hand, right, you do not want to completely stick to the form of the underlying stuff, because sometimes, let's say a leather jacket is going to be it's going to have its own rigidity. It's not going to be like very soft. It's not going to stick to your arm like a piece of cloth would, right? So you got to kind of remember that as well, and then kind of work with that. So right now I'm doing a bunch of back and forth, thinking about how, you know, a leather jacket would sort of fit onto this situation. So let's say I've run into trouble, you know, kind of pop out the reference, right? So I prepared this beforehand, and I'm kind of looking at it and thinking of how exactly, you know, this could be helpful to me. Right, because right now we're using a different pose. It's not going to be immediately helpful in the same way as a direct reference would, but I still want to make use of it, right? So what it does tell me is that, you know, a leather jacket has a bunch of creases. And that one thing I also noticed is that because of this centerpiece kind of shifting over the character's arm, it's going to be more of a direct transition. So I want to create more of this direct transition. And what it also tells me is that, you know, there's a bunch of creases flowing this way over to the point where the arm is in contact with the jacket. So we can try that as well. Right, it kind of originates from here and then it goes in like this. So on a second look, right, for example, let's say I did this and I'm checking it, and then it's like, okay, so this one doesn't look quite right. So what could be the problem? So if we remove this layer, you know, one of the issues here, I think, is that perhaps the arm wasn't designed, or rather my arm isn't kind of pushing on the jacket. The jacket is kind of just draping over it. So we can kind of reset that and give it another go, right? For example, because the arm is no longer exerting a force on the jacket is just gonna just naturally sit like this, right? Any crease is not gonna come from here, it's gonna come from here. Right, this could be how things actually are, and then we can continue editing things, seeing how it kind of fits with the form of the characters, stuff like that, right? So this looks much better than before, or what we were trying. So yeah, we can stick with this for the moment. And then in terms of the character sleeves, is also something that we can think about working on. But for this already sort of falls into a territory of like a slightly less important detail. Good to have, but slightly not quite as crucial. So we can leave it for later, but you know, we kind of want to figure out how we want to work this out. So one important thing is that we kind of want to make sure that for the areas where the forms are in contact with the skin, right? Remember the creases, and in this case, the gap isn't too big. And yeah, this is sort of how I'm doing it right now. So this is where the piece currently is, and now I'm looking at it and I'm kind of evaluating it. So okay, so what could be improved? And I also like to do something like this, where instead of drawing or painting this in, I could also add in something like a segment for her waist. Right, her waist is here, and it kind of expands to her hips, and then something like this, right? And let's say the groin or crotch area is here, and this is how it's gonna go. And the leg is just gonna kind of settle in like this. So what this does help me do is to kind of look at the forms and see, okay, is my actual painting conforming to these forms? And right now I'm having a couple of issues with this leg here specifically, because it's sort of not quite working out exactly how I want it to. So I want to kind of adjust it. And that is how I'm going to be continuing to paint the forms here as well, right? Because sometimes when you're trying to go for one thing, you might unintentionally adopt a different form, and then it's not what you want, so you end up essentially losing the plot per se. And especially when you're casting shadows on an odd sort of space like this, it can get a bit messy as well. So you kind of want to be careful. You want to make sure that, for example, just now my shadows here were too low. So it felt like it lowered the character's hip a bit too much, or pushed the leg forward a bit too much. So here's also a difficulty with cast shadows, right? It's really easy to kind of misplace them, and then, you know, you kind of create an unintended form. So definitely this is one thing I still have to work out for a bit. Might take a couple of tries. But yeah, so this is pretty much how I would be rendering things at this stage. And so the last part that I realized we only have a little time to touch on is starting the detailing process. So for detailing, what I like to do is to essentially just start painting in the forms rather than the lines, right? So for example, if you want to want to fix this window area, I've activated my perspective line. So I want to fix this window area. What I like to do is to kind of fix the forms first. And go in, make sure the basic form of this rigid line is in. Kind of get rid of the excess stuff like there. Right, get rid of the excess stuff, kind of connect it to the next piece of wall, the relevant space. And if it's very foreshortened, I try to add a bit of texture running in this direction to get it a bit more in line. Right, for example, it's a very thick beam. I could obviously extend its thickness. And then vertically, I can also make a bit of difference here as well. And so, when, let's say I want to draw in a detail here, I can first start with a rough silhouette, and then apply the forms as well, and apply the forms after that. Right, and I can adjust the silhouette on the fly, stuff like that, right? So this is how I would try to do something like this. And one thing to pay attention to when we're adding detail is also the foreshortening and the perspective as well. So, you know, you can see that I got a bit lost in drawing this thing as if, right, like we were looking at it from the front, but in fact, we're looking at it from a really steep angle. So rightfully, we should be seeing mostly something like this, with the sort of inside facing surface being really, really compressed. So this is how it would actually look like. And this is just the beginning, right? There's going to have to repeat this for everything that is currently in this sort of area. It's going to be, it's not going to be an easy time. So it's definitely one of those pieces I'll be taking my time with and slowly working out. So let's say you want to add a new bit of detail to the area. For example, let's say you want to add, you know, someone fallen over. Well, today we're just talking on the sort of planning the placement. So let's say you want to say someone fell over here, and then, you know, their hand is here. Very, very stereotypical guy fallen over look. You know, the hand is here. So this is how I would do a bit of pre-planning, something like this, right? So what this helps us do is to really kind of create the thumbnail first and then work from it later on. So we set up the thumbnail here, and then we can work from it later on. If you want to paint in the hand, if you want to add a bit of lighting onto it, make it reflective, stuff like that, right? So this is all essentially almost the same part of the drawing process, where we are rendering, bringing it closer to a finish, and then also planning in additional supporting details. So there's a bit of a hierarchy of things, right? For example, when the main drawing reaches like stage 9 out of 10, the very small supporting details can maybe be at stage 3, because the small supporting details aren't aiming to reach stage 9 as well. They maybe just need to reach like stage 5 for things to be done. So yeah. So this is what so this is how basically my process goes. And this video has actually gone on for an hour as well. So, you know, this is kind of my designated time to cut the video, and hopefully I tried to make this really packed with information, so it has been helpful for you as well to listen to this. And I definitely think, you know, with the experience I've gathered making this particular series, I'll be able to make better tutorials in the future as well. So, you know, I'm looking forward to that. But for now, I'm going to leave this rendering process here. You know, as you can see, there's still things to go to and deal with. But, you know, this is generally how the process goes. This is how the thinking process goes. This is how I would approach a drawing and then paint it my way. So yeah, so today's episode has been on bringing out the final piece, and this is sort of the main process that goes into getting it done. And so in the next video, I will very likely skip forward a little bit to slightly even more finished stage, and then we can add in the detail and talk about finishing touches. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for watching this video and supporting me here on Patreon, and I hope to see you next month.